Thank you all. It was March of 2012, and I had just arrived in Moscow from Kazakhstan to lead the review and update of the project execution plan for the Caspian Pipeline expansion. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium's offices were in Moscow, and I'd done a lot of work for them through the years and off and on. But this trip was a little unusual. There were certain places I knew not to go in Moscow. For example, there was a period of time where Chechen rebels were a great threat, and we knew better than to go down into the subway areas, subway stations. Though in Moscow, they're apparently quite gorgeous. I'd never seen them because they're favorite spots of bombing of Chechen terrorists. But this particular visit was even more dramatic. The previous Sunday, I think it was March 4th, there had been an election. And it was the first election that Russia had had under the new constitution. And surprise, surprise, Putin got elected president. A lot of people found that a little bit hard to believe, apparently. And we knew there was going to be some turmoil and probably some protests. We started our meetings that morning. I think it was the Tuesday morning that we began our meetings, knowing that we probably needed to break early that day because it may take a while to get back. The hotel I used to stay in was on the opposite side of the Kremlin in Red Square from the Caspian Pipeline Consortium offices, so we had to drive right past it every day. It was walking distance, but we never walked. So that day we broke early and headed back, and even though it was maybe just a half a mile, it took over 2 hours to get back. And the reason was that as soon as we got over the bridge into the precincts of the Kremlin, there were Russian soldiers everywhere. Every square foot of turf was covered either by a Russian soldier or a truck filled with other Russian soldiers. I couldn't have told you what color the pavement was because it was completely covered. Apparently, the government had been told that there was a protest planned, and I guess they figured that if there was going to be a protest there, they were going to have to do it on top of the soldiers because there was no room left on the ground. So we were working our way through this crowd. You can imagine, just see this little cab I was in, inching its way through this crowd of soldiers, waiting for them to part as we inched forward. And as we got close to the hotel, at least within walking distance, I asked the driver, why such a response? Why so many soldiers? Now, I knew what was going on. I knew about the election and the protests, and that was just the beginning of the protests of that election. But I asked him, well, why such a response from the military? And he answered in 4 words: they fear the people. If you're in oil and gas, I know many of you are, you've traveled around different places, and you know that not every place is the same in that regard. Some places there's a little bit more adventure. I was used to going to some places where you clear passport control and you're met by security detail with automatic weapons. Other places, when there's an election coming up, you leave the country until the election is over, then you can come back. Other places beautiful cities where you want more than anything to get out and tour and look around, but maybe at times there are just too many protests right now and it wouldn't be safe, and so you just stay at the hotel. I was experienced in that sense. I'd seen a lot of different things, but I always enjoyed the opportunity to, as much as I enjoyed the travel and meeting people from all over the world, there was something special about coming home because it just felt like we didn't experience that kind of thing. Things have changed a little bit, haven't they? A poll was released just this last week by the Trafalgar Group. It's kind of revealing. It asks a question, simple question, of registered voters. Someday they're going to ask other people questions, but for now it's registered voters. So they ask registered voters, and here's the question: do you believe American society and culture is in a state of decay or a state of progress? That was the question. And here's the answer. State of decay, 77%. State of progress, much smaller number. The unsures, there are more unsures than there are state of progress. And here's what's fascinating about this result. You get essentially the same result regardless of who you ask. These results are very consistent across political affiliation, across age group, regardless of gender. nationality, ethnicity, almost every group gives essentially the same response. Now, what they meant by that, of course, would be different from the different groups. But isn't it revealing that such a large majority of our fellow members of the American family feel as though our culture, our society, is in a state of decay? As I think about that, I remember something the Apostle Paul said in Acts 17. And remember that section? He's talking to the people in Greece there, and he says that God assigns to people the times in which they live, the places they live. Have you thought about that? That this time, in this place, with all of the excitement and confusion and frustration that you might feel, this is our divine assignment. This is our calling. This is when and where God wanted us. So here we are. The question is, will we rise to that occasion? I mentioned that I'd been a lot of places. Some of them, life can be a little bit difficult. Let me tell you, the most impressive Christians that I ever knew in the oil and gas industry, just traveling around the world, about 25 countries, were the Nigerians. I knew some Nigerian Christians. Now, Nigeria is not necessarily an easy place to live. But these Christians that I know, many of them, had taken the seriousness of their faith, their boldness, their courage to a level that I never had. And I love it when they come over here and bring it with them because it's awesome to watch. And so it's exciting to see that you can actually respond to challenging times in a way that's bold and courageous, that accepts the challenge, and that represents God well. But it's also possible to run and hide. It's also possible to crawl into a corner and kind of wait for it to all go away, or to try to engage the problems in some other way other than God's way, using God's tools and following God's will. What we're going to do over the next number of weeks is study a wonderful book of the Bible, and you've already heard what it is. It's the Book of Esther. There's some things I love about that book. For one thing, it's a book about tough times. It's a book, it's in a time when the people of God have really no power to speak of at all. In fact, their very existence, we'll see as the book unfolds, is threatened. The people in charge, complete pagans who do not know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they have all the power. And their actions are threatening the very existence of God's people. But there's something else about the book that's fascinating, and I think, for me, exciting. It's a time in history that is a lot like ours in this sense. God stays off stage. He doesn't make appearances. You can read through the entire book of Esther and never see the word God in the whole book. Now, is that allowed? I didn't know that was allowed. There are people who have questioned the canonicity of the book of Esther, whether it belongs in the Bible, because it never mentions the name of God. You don't see anybody praying, not explicitly. How did this book make it in? Well, I don't know, actually I do know, but it's irrelevant. But the point is this. That seems a lot like my world today. I had a lot of fun last week with you looking through the Gospel of Mark and seeing what it must have been like to walk with Jesus and to see his power and his authority. There are these scenes in the movie The Chosen, I'm sure many of you have seen it, where the disciples know that Jesus is about to do something, and they're kind of looking at each other like, here we go. They kind of got that knowing look. You can almost imagine that must have been what it was like to walk with Jesus. And yes, the Romans were in charge, and the people of Israel were under oppression, and all those bad things were happening. But to have Jesus there with such power and such authority and must have been thrilling. We don't get that. Well, we do. I mean, we're the body of Christ. Yeah, well, I got to say, I love you. But if I got to hang out with Jesus this afternoon instead, I'd be going with him. He is present spiritually, but not visibly, or at least he doesn't seem to be. Well, that's the way things are in the book of Esther, because they're facing tough times, but they're facing tough times with God off stage. And his name never even mentioned. There's no Messiah walking into the middle of chapter 3, performing miracles. In other words, it's a book a whole lot like our lives. And what the book will teach us, and it's very exciting, the book will teach us how to navigate tough times with courage and boldness, seeing how God is in fact at work all around us, and having seen that, moving forward in his calling on our lives, doing that hard thing that we know now he wants us to do, acting in a way that's truly difference-making, even though Jesus isn't physically standing right there beside us, because we see how he's at work. This series we're calling Courageous Faith. And the subtitle we might give it is Trusting God When Times Are Tough. That's what the book is about. It's a book about how to respond to tough times with insight into how God is at work. And with that insight, boldness in doing the thing he's called us to do. We'll see that play out in this book. It's interesting. Near the beginning of the book, the people of God are like you and me. God's at work, but they miss it. They don't see it. But gradually, they begin to notice. Soon they begin to see, wait a minute, God's in this. And seeing how God is at work, they begin to realize what he's calling them to do, how he's calling them to act, what the next step is for them and the difference that might make. And they recognize the courage it's going to take to act in that way, and yet they find in themselves in the courage to take that step. That's what this book's going to help us do, because God is at work in your life. In fact, the book is about more than just these grand social periods of conflict. It's just as relevant for the little things that you're going through in your life. When we first studied this book together, Julie was going through breast cancer, not a little thing, but on a grand global scale of international conflict and social decay, yeah, it seems like a little thing. But the insights from the book were just as powerful and helpful for us there, because, and here's why, and I know you've experienced this, haven't you? Have you ever had a time that you've gone through a tough period, something's going on, and you begin to pray about it, and you want God to intervene, and you're asking him to be there for you, and you look around and you don't see him. And you're wondering, well, where is God, and what does he want me to do? And you seem lost and confused. It's just not clear. But then, as things play out, God begins to move, and you suddenly realize that he was moving all along. And you look back on the event after it's over, and you see that, yes, God was there. Look what he did. He showed up in advance of the problem. He already set this up for me. Now, wouldn't it be exciting if you could actually see some of those things in real time? Because, by the way, I don't necessarily think that the things that God does were intended to go unnoticed. There are certain things he does around us that he's perfectly fine if you connect the dots and see them. He doesn't mind that at all. In fact, if you were to notice those things, it would embolden you to trust him on the things that he hasn't shown you, that he hasn't chosen to share with you. And so the objective here of this study and of this book is to help us get better at seeing how God is at work in our lives, to see the things he's doing, and seeing those things, be emboldened to trust him with the things he hasn't shown us yet, so that we can move forward in faith and in courage. Whether these are small things in your personal life, individual challenges you're facing, or big cultural moments that God's called us to navigate for his glory. Funny thing, though, about the book, in addition to the fact that God's name is never mentioned, he's not even in the credits. You know, at the end when they roll the credits and things, he's not even there. I mean, it's like totally absent, except he's not. But the other thing that's kind of funny is when you start the book in chapter 1, Esther doesn't even show up in chapter 1. Now, the book is called Esther. And you would expect something like, once upon a time, there was a young woman named Esther, or something like that. She doesn't even show up in chapter 1. There's nobody named Esther until chapter 2. Well, this is funny. This is going to be an interesting book. Yeah, chapter 1's fascinating. Let's look at it together. The point of chapter 1 is really this. This is the title of really today's lesson. Real life, real problems. We don't see Esther in chapter 1, but we meet some real people. And we see them doing life, running into challenges and difficulties, and handling them badly. They are handling them badly. In other words, a lot like I handle them sometimes. We'll see some similarities. So, chapter 1, verse 1. Warning, I'm using the NIV. And the reason two reasons. Number one is I think the NIV just reads a little bit easier in the narrative of the story. Secondly, this is going to sound so petty, but this is my weird brain. I think of the king as Xerxes, not as Ahasuerus. And the other translations, like English Standard Version and New American Standard, they call him Ahasuerus. And if you say Ahasuerus, I'll say, God bless you. So Xerxes is the way I think of him. But, the Hebrews called him Ahasuerus. The Greeks called him Xerxes. The Persian name is like 10 letters long in the English transliteration, and there are only 2 vowels, and it sounds vaguely Klingon, and I have no idea how to pronounce it. So I'm going to stick with Xerxes. Your Bible may say Ahasuerus. It's all the same guy. It's all the same guy. Chapter 1, verse 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, perhaps in your Bible. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the Citadel of Souza. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles, and so on. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who reigned over 127 provinces. Xerxes, at the time the story opens, is the absolute ruler of the Medo-Persian Empire. The date is about 483 BC. In other words, it's about 53 years after the closing of the book of Daniel, just to give you the timeline. 53 years have passed since the ministry of Daniel. Now, of course, many of the things that Daniel prophesied are actually happening during this time of history, and some of them are even still future for us. But Daniel's actual earthly sojourn in his ministry, the writing of that book, was 53 years prior to this. You remember the story from Daniel chapter 5, when the Babylonians were in charge, and there was the Belshazzar's feast, and that's when the Darius, a different Darius from the one that I'm going to mention in a moment, the Medo-Persian general, they swept in, they conquered Babylon, and it became part of the much larger Medo-Persian Empire that began at that time. Well, that empire has been in existence now for about 53 years, a little bit more, almost 60 now. And the previous emperor, the previous king, was Xerxes' father, Darius. And before that was the Cyrus that you might remember the Bible talks a whole lot about. Basically, Cyrus built the empire. Darius came along and organized it and secured the borders and got all the governmental systems going. And he's died just 3 years prior, and now his son Xerxes has taken over. When Darius died, the Egyptians saw that as an opportunity to revolt. And so the first thing Xerxes had to do is go down to Egypt, take care of that, get Egypt back under control. And now this story opens 3 years after Xerxes has come to power. So here we are. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the Citadel of Souza. Xerxes had like 5 palaces. This was his winter palace, located, if you can picture the Persian Gulf, the north end of the Persian Gulf, you have the border of Iran and Iraq. The Citadel of Souza was just about right there on that border at the northern end of the Persian Gulf. That's where his winter palace was there. And that's where the story unfolds. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the Citadel of Souza. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles and the provinces were present. Big banquet. What we're going to find in the upcoming verses is this is actually a 180-day event of some sort. The Greek historian Herodotus describes this very event. And what was going on here is that Xerxes was planning an upcoming invasion of the Greeks. It was a bit of unfinished business for his family. Let me tell you about what had happened. When his father Darius was king, there was a little dust-up over in what is today Turkey on the western coast where some Greeks lived. The Greek city-states that had been independent there for a while had been conquered by the Persians, and the Greeks didn't like it. And so about 499, something like that, there was a revolt among the Greek cities that were under Persian rule along the western coast of what is today Turkey. The Athenians came to their aid. They're going to help out their brother Greeks to throw off the rule of this massive Persian empire. It did not go well. That rebellion was brutally crushed. And Darius never forgave the Athenians for meddling in Persian affairs. And so one thing on his to-do list was crush the Athenians, deal with these Athenians, and also some Eritreans, another Greek group that were part of helping out those Greeks on the Ionian coast. But he never got around to it. He died before he could deal with it. It was a bit of family unfinished business. So when Xerxes came to the throne and dealt with the Egyptians, the time had come to deal with the Athenians. And the plan was to attack them in 480. By the way, I failed to mention, Darius did respond immediately to the Athenians at the Battle of Marathon, and the Persians were crushed. Herodotus tells the story. There were maybe 200 Athenians, Greeks that died in the battle, but 60,000 Persians. It was a crushing defeat for the Persians, which made the Athenian insolence even more intolerable and made Xerxes even more determined to go back once for all, deal with the Greeks. So this event we're seeing is a meeting of King Xerxes with the nobles and officials of the Persian Empire, including military leaders, to plan what would eventually be the greatest military expeditionary force the world had seen to that time. They're going to deal with the Greeks. So, verse 4, for a full 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. And when those days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days. We'll get back to the banquet. But I'm going to pause for a moment with just a brief word of application. All these challenges of empires and dealing with the Egyptians first and then the Greeks and all the 127 provinces and ruling Persian families over a vast empire, the biggest the world had seen at that time, that's a little outside of my experience. But I do know what it's like to, number one, face real-world challenges, obviously, but then number two, respond to those challenges out of my own talent, out of my own strength, out of my own abilities. What is Xerxes putting on display here? Basically, he's inviting these other officials to join him in the invasion, wholesale invasion of Greece, Athens, and Sparta. But what he's doing is showing them that he's got the resources and the capabilities and all the riches and all that he needs to pull it off. I haven't invaded the Greeks in a while, but I do the same thing. My first reaction when I face a challenge of any kind is to say, well, what am I good at? And then I figure out a way to use whatever it is I'm good at to solve this particular problem. You know the old saying that if the only tool you have is a hammer, you treat every problem as though it were a nail? I do that all the time. But you know what? They're not all nails. There are certain things that I know that I'm good at. I'm 62 years old. I've been around for a while. I know what I'm good at, and I know what I'm terrible at. But I've got a long history of approaching whatever problem I might be given by reaching into the toolkit of the few things I'm good at as though they're the answer. Isn't it amazing? No matter what problem comes along, oh, I know what's needed here, and I reach in for those same tools. Then another problem, totally different, comes along. Oh, I've got the perfect solution for that. I reach in, it's the same set of tools. No matter what it is. It's planning, it's strategizing, it's trying to persuade people in different settings. I mean, I'm good at that kind of thing. So isn't it convenient that no matter what challenge I face in this life, that's always the answer? Of course, that's nonsense. In fact, it's almost never the answer. Sometimes it comes in handy, but it's rarely the case that just the right answer to whatever problem you're facing is the things you've been good at all along. Now, I don't mean to suggest that I leave this totally unsanctified. I mean, I'll plan my response out of my strengths, but don't worry. I will pray and ask God to bless that plan. I mean, I've got it all figured out. There's very little work for him to do other than bless that. Now, when it utterly fails, I might throw myself more open to his suggestions, but I always start with the things I'm good at. What we see here is a simple principle. When confronting life's challenges, be realistic about your abilities and accomplishments. We do not see Xerxes here being realistic, and I rarely see myself being realistic. But when you confront life's challenges, just a pro tip, be realistic about the extent to which Your talents and skills are the answer to the problem. But reading on, verse 5. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Souza. This banquet, the word that's used here, is suggestive of it's more of a drinking bout. This is a drinking party, as we'll see as the story unfolds. The guest list said it from the greatest to least who lived in the citadel of Souza. Not who lived in the city surrounding it, but basically who lived in the palace. So there were no people like you and me at that party. These were all people that were either residents of the palace in one way or another, or guests that he'd been working with now for the last 6 months, the last 180 days, planning the invasion of Greece. So after 6 months of planning, they celebrate the whole thing in their wonderful plan they've put together with a week-long drinking party, at least the guys. Verse 6, what was this garden like? Where was this being held? The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Incredibly beautiful setting. But this is only describing the pavilion they're in. The garden itself, these were called paradises. And they were some of the wonders of the ancient world. You can imagine, if you have a palace out in the middle of the desert, one of the most impressive things you can do is build, in the middle of the desert, this lush walled garden. And that's what they did. Fantastically beautiful places. In fact, some were so beautiful and so big that they even stocked them with livestock, with wild animals, not livestock, so that the king could take his buddies on a hunting party in the walled garden at the palace. This was one of those kind of places. Absolutely fabulous environment. And in addition to the beauty of the place, there was a pavilion there and the beautiful stones and the hangings and all. Stunningly gorgeous. Yet another display of King Xerxes' wealth and power. But now let's get to the drinking. Verse 7. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. And the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way. In other words, as much as you wanted. There was no one there to say, I'm sorry, you've had enough. No, that wasn't going to happen. For the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. So this is the setting. And the party's gone on for several days. So you have all these powerful people celebrating their power, celebrating their magnificence, celebrating what they see as the inevitable conquest of the Greeks. We'll see how that works out next week. And then the king has an idea. You know, people have heard about his queen, Vashti, and about how beautiful she is, but they've never actually seen her. And he's talked about her. But I don't know if somebody challenged him, well, bring her out or something. But he had this idea that he's finally going to show these assembled nobles what a truly beautiful woman is. Okay, so verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. So she's nearby with the women. This party that we've just described, that's just the guys. The women are with the queen in the palace having a party of their own. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he was drunk, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, verse 11, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Bring her out! They'd heard about her quite enough. They want to see this woman. So let's bring her out. Vashti. Who is she? Well, the name Vashti doesn't appear outside of Scripture. But Herodotus tells us that Xerxes' queen at this time was a woman called Amestris, and history knows a lot about her. She was brilliant, accomplished, cunning, incredibly ruthless and cruel, and by all accounts, stunningly beautiful. Well, what's this Vashti then? Vashti appears to be related to a Persian word that means desired one. So it could have been a kind of pet name for Amestris. After all, the queen of this empire wasn't a queen like, Queen Elizabeth. She was really sort of the most favored concubine in the harem. And so regarded as queen. So she was the king's desired one. And a stunningly beautiful woman who had a lot more going for her too. And the king, in a drunken state, decides that it's a good idea to put her on display. What does she think about that? Verse 12. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. I don't know if there is a Persian word for no, but I'm pretty sure Xerxes had never heard it. I mean, think about this. First of all, let's start with Vashti's point of view. She doesn't make public appearances. She's not a media star. She lives her life in the palace, in luxurious isolation. She is not put on public display, certainly not for a bunch of drunks. On top of that, she is in all likelihood at this moment pregnant with the royal heir, Artaxerxes. And so she's probably showing. And if this is a mistress, probably is, she's not the kind of person that wants to be used this way anyway. One rabbinic scholar way back actually suggested that, it's possible that the crown was all the king wanted her to wear. Whatever the case, she said, oh no, this is not going to happen. No. Imagine being the eunuch that takes that word back to the king. No. Well, into verse 12, then the king became furious and burned with anger. Let's pause for another moment of application. It's so tempting to think that my strengths are the answer to the problem. But, when you're confronting life's challenges, this is the next point, it's on the screen. Don't expect your abilities to prevent problems. You might even find that they make the problems worse. How did they get into this mess? They got into this mess for two reasons. Number one, the king is showing off his wealth, his power, his influence, his possessions, including Vashti, a mistress. And he takes it way too far. And Vashti, strong, proud, refuses to go along. His strengths, her strengths, collision course. Isn't that interesting? I don't know about you, but I've often found that my strengths aren't necessarily the solution. In fact, sometimes they're the cause of the problem and actually make the problem worse. And this isn't the main point of chapter 1. We're just picking up these valuable lessons along the way, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But just don't miss that lesson. That when you're facing life's challenges, your strengths aren't necessarily the answer. They may actually be part of the problem. Overuse of them, overdependence on them, making matters worse. That's what's happening here. But reading on, what's the king going to do? Because think about this. He has just promised all these guys, all these nobles, that he spent 6 months impressing that he's got all this power and he's going to defeat the Greeks. And now he's asked his wife to make an appearance and she said no. In front of all these guys. Meanwhile, back inside the palace, when she said no, she wasn't alone. All those other women there heard her say no. So suddenly, all these guys that have been drinking for 7 days are stone cold sober. Look at verse 13. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. And he gives their names. These names are amazing. These guys show up 23 years later as advisors to his son Artaxerxes. They've been around for a while. They'll be around for a lot longer. These are the go-to advisors in the royal household. What am I going to do? These are people, nobles of Persia and Media in their own right, who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. And Xerxes said to them, according to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. What are we going to do? I'm not sure the law speaks to this, because I don't know that the law would ever have anticipated anybody saying no to the king. She did. Then Memucan, one of the 7, replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. What? How does he figure that? She's done wrong not only to the king, but to all the nobles in all of the provinces in all of the Medo-Persian Empire? Really? Well, listen to what he says, verse 17. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she didn't come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles, us, in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. They're in a stone cold panic. And you guys were going to defeat the Greeks. This is awesome. You know, it's amazing. Just a few verses ago, he was the unquestioned ruler of 127 provinces, and the whole thing's falling apart. The whole thing's falling apart. And there's a lesson in that, by the way, because nowadays especially, I guess this has always been true, but our assumption is we face a challenge and things aren't going the way we want them to go. Our assumption is, well, I just don't have enough power. Or our side doesn't have enough power. If we just were more powerful, if we just had that top job, if we had somebody in a position of greatest power, then we'd be in control. Then we could work things out. You know what's amazing about Xerxes throughout this book? The guy's never in control. He's always sort of missing what's happening around him, being manipulated and outmaneuvered. And here in chapter 1, we suddenly find him almost helpless just because of one person, his wife, his queen. Don't make the mistake of thinking that the problem is we don't have enough power. That's just another example of looking to the wrong strengths to try to solve the problems God has called us to address. Anyway, so there's the idea that, well, something's got to be done. So here's the suggestion. Here's the suggestion. Therefore, verse 19, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed. Okay, here we go. That Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Notice, it's not Queen Vashti anymore. Title's already gone. That Vashti is never again to enter the presence of the king. Kind of an elegant solution, really. Let her decision become her punishment. She didn't want to come to the king, into his presence. So be it. She will never again come into the presence of the king. That does not, by the way, mean that she's going to be banished from the palace. She is expecting the royal heir. She will still live a life of luxury. She will have her baby. And when Xerxes finally dies and Artaxerxes becomes king, Amestris reappears on the pages of history as a powerful queen mother type figure. And she's scary. There are stories about times where some people kind of got crossways with her. She buried them alive. So this is Amestris. This is Vashti. But at this moment, she doesn't appear before the king ever again, and she goes into isolation until her son Artaxerxes ascends to the throne. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice. That's what we'll do. So the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script and to each people in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should be ruler over his own household. They had quite a system for getting the word out. They had two systems. One was, if you remember the old movie, the Lord of the Rings movie, Return of the King, there's a system of signal fires on top of mountains that got the message out very quickly. They had a system like that. And also a system like, sort of a Pony Express kind of system. This word went out probably before the women left the party. They definitely got ahead of this. And the word went out that, well, you saw about each man's going to be ruler over his own household or something like that. Whew. Disaster averted. Or so they think. Now, on to the Greeks. If the whole thing looks kind of pitiful, it's because it is. In fact, it usually is pretty pitiful anytime we face challenges out of our own strength. Thinking that our own resources, that's the answer. That's going to make the difference. That's going to turn everything around. Me reaching into my own toolkit. Now, chances are, if God's given you gifts and abilities, it's because he wants to use them. But he wants to use them in his way, in his approach. And we'll see how that plays out as the book unfolds. But here at the beginning, just some simple principles. And the third one is this. When confronting life's challenges, don't depend on your abilities to solve your problems. They probably won't. Vashti has lost a lot here. Xerxes has lost a lot here. The companionship of the woman above all others that he desired the most. And the respect of the people around him that he'd spent 6 months impressing. The whole thing turned into a mess. And it turned into a mess because this guy was over-depending on his own abilities. And in a real sense, so was she. And that usually happens when we do the same thing. So, there you have chapter 1. Story of two crazy people that are living a life nothing like the one I live in some ways, but a lot like it in others. And we pick up some good lessons along the way. But what does this have to do with anything else? Why is this the first chapter in the book of Esther? You see, here's the point. The 3 points I just shared with you really miss the point of chapter 1 completely. Because the point of chapter 1 is this, that God is setting up his response through these events and these people to a crisis that won't happen for another decade. These are chess pieces on God's chessboard. And he knows that almost 10 years from now, a crisis will threaten the very existence of his people. And before the crisis occurs, long before anybody appeals to him for help, before anything has even happened, God is already at work, setting the pieces in place for the ultimate victory of his people. It's absolutely incredible. And these people have no way of knowing that that's what's going on. That they are being moved around by the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob for the eternal benefit of his beloved people. And you know what? He does the same thing in your life. There isn't a crisis you've ever faced that God didn't know about in advance and that God didn't act on in advance. And when the crisis finally comes, it's new to us, but it wasn't new to him. He's known about it for eternity. And chances are very good that he's already, even before the crisis occurred, begun to set up the solution to the problem. And I'll bet you that if you think about it, that you can look back and see times when that was so, where he was already there taking care of you, already putting events in place and people in the right positions and all set up, and you missed it completely. You had no idea that's what he was doing. But he knew what he was doing. And when the crisis comes, you feel the fear and the panic, and you start wondering when God's going to intervene. You don't even know. He already has. He's there. He's been there a long time. That's what's actually happening in this chapter. And as the events continue to unfold in chapter 2, eventually the people of God in the story start to pick up on that and think, wait a minute, I think God got here first. And they realize that there's a call on their lives to act accordingly, and there's a call on our lives to act accordingly. So that is chapter 1. And I got something to ask you. Do not read ahead. Don't do it. The book is a lot more exciting and effective. Even if you've read it before, if you've seen a movie, forget the movie. The movies are a mess. But if you've read the book before, just let's go through this together. And you can look back at chapter 1, and if you're in the life group, you'll have some questions to look at and things to share from your own experiences that'll show you that God is doing these things in your life. It's not just a story on the pages of the Bible, it's your own story. And let God convince you of that, and then we'll open chapter 2 together next time. Let me pray for us. Father, I thank you for your love for us. I thank you for your presence in our lives, for the way that you get to the crisis even before it's happened. And I thank you that we can learn from our mistakes. The mistake of depending on ourselves too much and on you too little, of reaching into our own toolbox of limited skills and abilities as though that's the answer, when in fact we need to learn to turn to you and say, how do you want to use me in the answer you've put together, Lord? Father, I pray that you would use this book over the coming weeks to equip us to respond well to these challenging times, that we would represent you well and in a way that makes the difference you want us to make in the world. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.